The first thing most species noticed about humans was their faces. Not the shape of them, not the color of their eyes or the softness of their skin. It was the way those faces moved. The way a human could look directly at you while you insulted them and still produce something that resembled warmth. The Quillari diplomat Vareth had spent 11 years on Vareth 9 Station watching human delegates sit through trade meetings, budget hearings, and political sessions where they were spoken to like children. And every time, without fail, the human across the table would nod and smile and say something reasonable. It had taken Vareth a long time to stop finding it reassuring. The Grand Convocation of the Galactic Concord happened every 4 years. 17 civilizations sent their representatives to Vareth 9, a station built on neutral ground between 3 star systems, and spent 30 days arguing about trade routes, territorial limits, technology quotas, and 100 smaller things that nobody fully agreed on, but everyone eventually signed. It was not a pleasant process, but it was the process, and it had kept the peace, more or less, for nearly 400 years. Humanity had been part of it for 112. They had joined after the Reneth incident. That was what the official Concord records called it. The Reneth incident. A clean name for a dirty thing. 112 years ago, the Renethi collective had been expanding fast, pushing their trade corridors outward, and 11 human colony ships had been moving through unclaimed space on coordinates provided by a Renethi navigation bureau. The coordinates were wrong. Not by accident. By design. The ships flew into a pulsar field. 83,214 people died in approximately 6 minutes. The war that came after lasted 9 years. Humanity fought hard. Humanity lost. At the Accord of Stillwater, Earth signed away 3 frontier systems, agreed to a 100-year period called the Integration Tier, which meant reduced votes in the Concord, no war fleet, mandatory technology sharing, and took their seat at the table as what the Renethi privately called a corrected species. Ambassador Doran Fell was the human representative at this year's convocation. He was not a tall man. He had dark hair going gray at the edges, careful hands, and the kind of face that made other people feel at ease without trying. He spoke 6 alien languages without a translator, which was unusual. Most species found learning alien languages difficult. Humans seemed to find it interesting. On the 4th day of the convocation, the session was about resource tariffs. The Renethi had proposed a new rate on raw mineral exports from human-controlled asteroid belts, a rate that would cut human mining revenue by roughly a third. The justification was a 15-page document full of economic language that, when reduced to its basic meaning, said, "We can, so we will." Sovarun, the senior Renethi ambassador, presented it with the manner of someone who had already decided the outcome. He was older, with the long gray crest that marked Renethi seniority, and he spoke with the slow deliberateness of a person who had never been told no by anyone he considered important. The adjusted rate reflects the current market balance, Sovereign said. Earth's mining output has grown considerably. It is only reasonable that the Concord benefit proportionally from that growth. There was a pause in the room. Several delegates looked at Fell. Fell looked at his documents, looked up, and said, "We understand the Concord's position. Earth will review the proposal and provide a formal response within the required window." That was it. No argument. No visible frustration. Just a polite acknowledgement that sounded almost like agreement. Sovereign moved to the next item on the agenda. Vareth, watching from the observer's tier, felt the old unease again. They had been a Quillari diplomat for 30 years. They had seen many species negotiate under pressure. Some got loud, some got cold, some threatened, and then apologized. Humans did none of those things. They just absorbed it and kept going. Vareth had once asked a human colleague, a trade liaison named Bessel, whether it bothered him, the way Earth was treated in these sessions. Bessel had looked at Vareth with a calm expression and said, "Everything bothers someone. The question is what you do with it." Then he had gone back to his paperwork. At the end of the day's session, a routine communication from Earth to Vareth 9 failed to arrive. Fell noticed. He checked the relay log quietly, said nothing to anyone, and sent a confirmation request back through the standard channel. He went to the evening reception, ate something small, spoke with 3 other ambassadors about a minor shipping agreement, and then returned to his quarters. The confirmation request also received no answer. He sat at his small desk and looked at the dark screen for a long time. Outside the wide port window, Varith 9's exterior lights moved slowly past the stars. The station rotated once every 40 minutes, and if you sat still long enough you could watch the same cluster of stars come around again. He did not appear worried. People who passed his door that night and glanced through the small window in it saw him reading. He had a physical book, actual paper, which humans apparently still use sometimes, and he was turning pages slowly, the way someone does when they are not in a hurry. But the screen on his desk stayed dark, and by the time the second day of failed communications had passed, Doran Fell had stopped sending inquiries. Not because he had given up on getting an answer, but because he already knew what the silence meant. He had been waiting for it for a very long time. It started as an administrative problem. The Concorde's communication department filed a standard fault report on day 6. 3 monitoring relays in the Sol system had stopped returning data. This happened occasionally. Relays broke, solar interference disrupted signals, maintenance cycles caused gaps. Someone would file a ticket, a repair crew would eventually go out, and the data would start flowing again. It was not interesting. It was not alarming. It was the kind of problem that got assigned to a junior coordinator and forgotten about by everyone else. By day 11, all 17 relays in Sol space were silent. That was no longer an administrative problem. The Concorde's logistics office escalated the matter to the Communications Council, which escalated it to the diplomatic floor, which brought it to the Convocation's emergency session table with the kind of careful, hedged language that organizations use when they want to sound calm about something that is making them very nervous. The report said, communication disruption of unclear origin affecting Sol system monitoring infrastructure. Nature of disruption, unknown. Estimated resolution timeline, under review. 3 trade ships had been dispatched toward Earth's outer stations when the relay failure was first noticed. Standard practice. They had not returned. No distress signals. No wreckage detected. No communication of any kind. They had simply gone into the Sol corridor and stopped existing as far as anyone on Varith 9 was concerned. Then the jump gate did it. The gate connecting Concorde space to the Sol corridor was one of the oldest on the network, installed back when Earth had first been integrated. It had always worked. But when a Concorde vessel attempted a standard transit on day 13, the gate refused the credentials. The crew tried again. The gate refused again. Then it returned a code. A single block of text in a format that nobody in the room immediately recognized, because it was written in a dialect of human administrative language that had not been used in official communication for decades. A translator on duty worked through it carefully and then read it aloud to the emergency session in a voice that was very flat, because she was trying not to let her tone communicate something she was not authorized to communicate. The message read, Accord null. Integration revoked. Standing, sovereign. The room was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Then 17 ambassadors began talking at once. The Renathi argued it was a technical malfunction, a corrupted response string from a gate with aging hardware. Sovereign said this with total confidence, in the tone of a person who finds the alternative too inconvenient to consider. The Dravani representatives believed it was preparation for an attack and began demanding fleet positioning reports. The Thon, a quieter species who preferred to say terrible things in a calm voice, suggested that perhaps a catastrophe had occurred on Earth, a plague, a collapse, a war, and automated systems were running responses without living operators behind them. Doran Fell sat in his seat through all of it and said almost nothing. When the session chair finally turned to him and asked, as Earth's representative, whether he had any insight into the situation, Fell looked up from the notepad he had been writing on and said, I'm sure Earth will communicate when it is ready. Then he looked back at his notepad. There was a silence after that which felt different from the other silences in the room. In the lower levels of Varith 9, away from the diplomatic floors, the Concorde employed a large staff of analysts and data specialists whose job was to track patterns, trade flows, population movements, technology outputs, communication traffic, across all member worlds. One of those analysts was a young Quillari named Breath. She was not senior. She had no diplomatic rank. Her job, on most days, was to cross-reference technology transfer submissions from member worlds against observed industrial activity, checking for discrepancies that might indicate treaty noncompliance. She was very good at her job. She had been looking at Earth's file for 6 years. Not because anyone asked her to. But because the numbers had always been slightly strange in a way she could not fully explain, and it bothered her the way an unsolved puzzle bothers a certain kind of mind. Earth's technology submissions to the Concorde were always exactly correct. Every formula matched the required format. Every blueprint was complete. Every submission arrived on time and passed verification. But when Breath compared those submissions against what she could observe, human industrial output, energy consumption on known orbital platforms, shipping volumes between Earth and its colonies, the numbers did not add up. Not hugely, just enough. As though someone was handing over everything they were required to hand over, and nothing more, and the thing they were keeping was much larger than the thing they were giving. She had filed a low-priority note about it 3 years ago. Nobody had responded. Now, with Soul gone dark and the emergency session running 2 floors above her, she pulled every file she had and spent 48 hours building the clearest picture she could. When she was done, she took it to the one person she trusted enough to bring it to. Vareth, who was senior enough to be heard and careful enough not to panic. Vareth read it twice, then sat very still. Breath said, "The submitted technology represents, at my best estimate, somewhere between 25 and 35% of what they actually developed over the last 4 decades. The rest is unaccounted for." Vareth took her to Fell's quarters that evening. Fell answered the door, looked at the data pad Breath was holding, and invited them in without any sign of surprise. He read through Breath's analysis slowly, carefully, with the same calm expression he brought to everything. When he finished, he looked at Breath directly for the first time, and what she saw in his face was not guilt or alarm. It was something closer to appreciation. He said, "You have a very sharp mind, Breath. Earth will appreciate that, one day." She asked what that meant. He said nothing more, only offered them tea, which neither of them took. That same night, Dorian Fell submitted his resignation as Earth's Concorde ambassador, citing personal reasons. By morning, he had already booked passage on a civilian transport heading toward the far rim. He left no forwarding address. Nobody on the diplomatic delegation had agreed on what they expected to find. 6 Concorde ships, carrying 17 representatives and a small support staff, had been dispatched to the Sol system on the Convocations Authority. The Renethi had insisted on leading the group. Sovereign had framed it as a matter of senior diplomatic precedent, though most of the other ambassadors privately felt he simply wanted to be the one in the room when humanity was corrected. The mission's stated purpose was dialogue. Its unstated purpose was to make clear, without saying it directly, that the Galactic Concorde did not consider the words on that gate code to be a real position. The jump gate accepted their credentials this time. That was the first strange thing. The gate that had refused all Concorde transit for the past 3 weeks simply opened for them, as though someone on the other side had decided to let them through. Not because the situation had changed, because they had been allowed. They came through the corridor and found themselves not at Earth orbit, not at any of the inner system platforms, but deposited near a structure on the far edge of the Sol system that did not appear in any Concorde record. Any record at all. Not in historical surveys, not in old maps, not in the monitoring relay data going back decades. It had not been built recently. The hull plating had the particular color of metal that has been in hard vacuum for a long time. The docking arms were settled and solid. The station had been here for years, perhaps longer, and nobody outside the Sol system had known it existed. It was large enough to dock 40 ships comfortably. A human woman met them at the airlock. She was neither young nor old, with close-cut hair and a plain gray uniform that carried no rank markings, no insignia, no decoration of any kind. She introduced herself as Administrator Lena Sword and welcomed them with the exact level of courtesy that the situation required, warm enough to avoid offense, formal enough to make clear they were not friends. She showed them to comfortable rooms. There was food. It was good food. The air was warm and the lighting was easy on the eyes. Every small comfort had been anticipated and provided. This, too, was strange because it did not feel like hospitality extended to partners. It felt like hospitality extended to guests who had not quite been invited. After they had settled, Sword met the full delegation in a round conference room and said, clearly and without apology, Earth is no longer a member of the Galactic Concorde. Notice of withdrawal was transmitted through proper channels at the moment the Heliopause communication array was activated. You are currently guests of the Sol Sovereign Authority. You will be treated well for the full duration of your stay. You will not be permitted to proceed further into the system without a formal invitation, which has not been extended at this time. Sova-Run responded the way he always responded to things he found unacceptable, which was to speak slowly and with great weight, as though the force of his seniority could reshape reality. He said that Earth's withdrawal was not recognized by the Concord. He said the integration tier agreement had not expired. He said that the Concord had invested considerable resources in Earth's development and that this was not how agreements between civilized species were dissolved. Sword listened to all of it. Then she said, "We are aware of the Concord's position. We do not share it. Is there anything else you need before the scheduled communication window?" Over the next 3 days, as the delegation waited, the picture came together in pieces. Breath had been given access to a small working terminal, a gesture that felt deliberate, as though someone had decided she deserved to see it, and she spent those days pulling apart everything she could find. The heliopause array was a ring of communication suppression platforms installed along the outermost boundary of the Sol system. It could prevent any signal from entering or leaving Sol space without human authorization. Not jam signals. Prevent them. The technology it was built on did not exist in any Concord database, shared or classified. The FTL network was different. Every ship in the Concord used the same basic principle for faster-than-light travel, a field geometry that the founding species had developed roughly 600 years ago and shared outward as other civilizations joined. Humanity had used it too, for 100 years. But what Breath found, working through shipping manifests and energy signatures from the outer Sol stations, was that the human fleet was not using that geometry anymore. The drive signatures were different. A different physical principle, one that Concord tracking systems were simply not calibrated to detect because it had never existed before. The fleet itself was visible now that they were inside the system's edge, not pointed at anyone, not maneuvering aggressively. It sat in a wide formation near the heliopause, ship after ship after ship, more than anyone in the delegation had expected to see, shaped and arranged the way a wall is arranged. Patient, definitive. The non-Concord contacts were perhaps the most alarming thing. Breath found evidence of 30 years of quiet diplomatic correspondence with 6 civilizations on the far rim, species the Concord knew existed but had never successfully incorporated. Trade agreements, mutual defense understandings, cultural exchanges. Humanity had been building a second table for 3 decades, and other people were already sitting at it. When Breath brought all of it to Verith in one document, Verith read it, and then closed their eyes for a moment. Breath said, "Every part of this was done quietly. Every part of this was done legally. Nothing in the integration tier agreement prevented them from doing any of it. We just never thought to ask whether they would." Verith said, "We thought patience meant they had accepted things as they were." Breath looked at the long list of ship signatures on her screen. "I think patience meant they had decided things would not stay as they were, and they were willing to wait until they were ready." In the morning, Lena Sword notified the delegation that the communication window with Earth's Council would open in 72 hours. She offered them breakfast first. It was, again, very good. The screen was smaller than anyone expected. Given the weight of the moment, a species withdrawing from the Galactic Concord for the first time in its 400-year history, a delegation sitting in a station that should not have existed, a fleet of ships sitting just outside the window like a fact that no one could argue with. Most of the 17 representatives had expected something theatrical. A grand chamber, a decorated official, a military figure, perhaps, with insignia and formality arranged to signal power. Instead, they got a plain room with bare walls and 7 people sitting around a table. The 7 looked like ordinary people, different ages, different builds, no uniforms. One of them, an older man with white hair and the kind of hands that had done physical work for many years, was clearly going to be the one who spoke. He was not introduced. He did not announce a title. He simply looked at the screen from his side of the connection, waited for the room to settle, and began. His name was Aldrich Howe. He spoke in Renethi, not translated, not assisted, but Sova Ren's own native dialect, the older formal register that the Renethi themselves rarely used anymore in everyday speech. The choice was not accidental. Nothing in this room, Breath was beginning to understand, had been accidental. Aldrich said, We want to be clear that we bear no hostility toward any person in this room, or toward the populations they represent. We have chosen to stop participating in an arrangement that was not designed for our benefit. We would like to explain our reasoning. Sovereign opened his mouth. Aldrich continued without pausing. What followed was not a speech in the way political speeches usually work. There was no rising emotion, no dramatic pauses, no appeals to pride or fear. It was a recounting, methodical, clear, and accompanied by a data feed that began displaying documents on every delegate's terminal, original records, treaty texts, internal Concord communications, trade calculations, as each point was named. He began with the Reneth incident. Not the Concord's name for it, but the description of what it was, navigation data, deliberately falsified, provided by an official Renethi bureau to human colony ships. 11 ships. A pulsar field. 83,214 people. He did not say this with anger. He said it with the precision of someone who had read the number many times and wanted to make sure it was heard clearly by everyone in the room. He moved to the Accord of Stillwater. He read the specific language of the integration tier, the clauses that reduced human voting rights, restricted military development, and required technology sharing. He noted that the agreement had been signed by a human government with no alternatives available to it, at the end of a war that humanity had not started and had not been able to win. He moved to the extension vote. 11 months ago, in a procedural session that had lasted 40 minutes, the Concord had voted to extend the integration tier for an additional 50 years. The vote had been 14-3. Earth had 3 votes, reduced, as per the tier agreement, and had used all of them against the extension. The motion had passed anyway, and a notification had been sent to Earth's ambassador, who at the time was Doran Fell, informing him of the outcome. It had been formatted as a routine administrative update. Then Aldrich said, "We would like you to understand something about every interaction Earth has had within the Concord over the last 112 years. Every agreement we signed, every resource transfer we approved, every tariff we accepted, every time one of our representatives said yes, or of course, or we understand, or certainly. We are aware of how it was interpreted. We are aware that most of you concluded, at some point, that humans were a species that had accepted their place. We want to tell you what was actually happening." He paused for the first time. "We were deciding not to be destroyed by it. There is a difference. You can absorb an injury without surrendering to it. You can agree to terms without agreeing that those terms are right. You can wait and build and say nothing, not because you have nothing to say, but because the moment has not yet arrived when saying it will matter. We are a patient species. We did not always choose to be. The Reneth incident made us patient. The Accord of Stillwater made us careful. The last 112 years made us ready. And when the Concord voted to extend the integration tier without a single human vote in favor, we decided that the moment had arrived." Sovereign's voice came sharp and hard. "Is this a declaration of war?" Aldrich looked at him with the same calm that every human diplomat had ever brought into every room in the Concord. The same warmth, the same steadiness, the same face that said nothing and meant everything. He said, "No, we are simply done." He told them what Earth's position was, and he told them simply. The sole sovereign authority would trade with any civilization willing to trade, on equal terms, with no tier system and no mandatory sharing of proprietary development. Earth would defend its borders and its allies. Earth had no interest in revenge, punishment, or expansion into Concord space. Earth was not asking for an apology, because an apology, at this point, would not mean very much. Sovereign said, "You are one world against 17 civilizations. You cannot hold this position." Aldrich's expression did not change. He said, "We are not one world. We stopped being one world a long time ago. We simply did not find it useful to mention that in Concord sessions." He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "We wish everyone in this room good health and good travels." The screen went dark. The room stayed quiet for a long time. Then Lena Sword opened the conference room door and offered the delegation a return escort to the jump gate. She was efficient and pleasant about it. She handed each representative a data packet containing Earth's new trade terms in case any Concord member wished to begin bilateral talks. She wished them a safe journey. Breath held her data packet and looked out the station window at the fleet sitting at the system's edge. She thought about 83,000 people. She thought about 112 years of meetings. She thought about every human diplomat she had ever watched sit through a session and smile. She had thought, all this time, that the smiling meant they were fine. She understood now that it meant something else entirely. The recording leaked before the delegation even made it back to the jump gate. Nobody admitted to releasing it. Nobody was punished for releasing it. The Concorde's internal review found no clear point of origin, which meant either someone very clever had done it, or several people in several places had done it at the same time, and the question of who started it was impossible to separate from the question of who continued it. Within 4 days of the communication window closing, the full recording of Aldrich Howe's address to the delegation was available on public networks across 11 of the 17 Concorde member worlds. The reactions were not uniform. On the Renethi home worlds, the official response was fury. State media called it a provocation. Legal teams argued that Earth's withdrawal violated a binding treaty. Military advisors gave briefings on response options. The government of the Renethi Collective moved fast to control the story, but the story was not easy to control because it came packaged with documents. 112 years of documents. And among those documents were things the Renethi government had spent a very long time hoping nobody would look at carefully. The original navigation data from the Reneth incident, intact, with the deliberate errors still visible in the calculation logs. That part had not been in the official record. It had been in a human archive. Earth had held a clean copy for a century and said nothing about it. Until now. On the Dravani worlds, the official response was much quieter, and several Dravani trade ministers were already requesting private communication lines to sole sovereign authority within a week of the recording's release. The Dravani had always been practical people. They saw which way things were moving, and they adjusted. The Quillari response was complicated. Vareth spent 3 days in private meetings before making any public statement. Their public statement said that the situation required careful consideration and that the Quillari people wished all parties well, which was the diplomatic equivalent of staying completely out of it while clearly stepping away from one side of the room. It was on the floor of the Concorde's emergency full council session, 3 weeks after the delegation returned, that the question became unavoidable. Sovereign stood before the council and argued for military action. He did not use those exact words. He used phrases like restoration of treaty integrity and enforcement of the Concorde's foundational agreements and proportionate response to unilateral breach. But the meaning was clear. He wanted ships moved to the Sol system boundary. He wanted pressure applied. He wanted humanity reminded that the Galactic Concorde had 17 members and Earth had 1 planet. He spoke for 40 minutes. He was good at this kind of speaking. He had spent his whole career in rooms where his voice carried weight, and he carried it well. Then a Dravani counselor named Orith asked for the floor. Orith was not a dramatic figure. He was old, even by Dravani standards, and he moved slowly, and he had a habit of pausing between sentences for slightly longer than other species found comfortable. He had spent 40 years as a cultural scholar before moving into diplomacy. He had written 3 books about humanity that almost nobody in the Concorde had read. He stood up and spoke without notes. He said, "I want to talk about a mistake we made. Not a political mistake or a strategic mistake. A mistake in understanding. We looked at humans in this council for 112 years, and we saw a species that had accepted correction. We told ourselves, look at them. They are reasonable now. They had a difficult beginning, and they learned from it. They take their smaller portion, and they do not complain. We used them as an example of how integration works. We congratulated ourselves." He paused. "I have spent 40 years reading human history. Not their recent history. Their old history. From before they left their planet. Humans have a very specific way of responding to betrayal. They do not always respond immediately. Sometimes they respond slowly, across very long periods of time, and the response does not look like anger. It looks like patience. It looks like cooperation. It looks like compliance. And then one day, something changes, and you realize they were not compliant at all. They were building. We had the evidence in front of us for decades. We chose to see what was comfortable." He looked directly at Sovereign. "They are not pointing weapons at us. Their fleet is sitting at their own border in a defensive arrangement. They have not attacked anyone. They have not threatened anyone. They have left. And I am asking this council to seriously consider whether sending warships to the border of a civilization that just demonstrated it has been quietly building a parallel fleet and a parallel FTL network for 40 years, while we thought they were our junior partners, is the action of people who have understood this situation. The room was very quiet. Breath submitted her formal analysis to the full council that same day. She had been working on it since the delegation returned, and it was thorough. The conclusion was stated plainly. Any military engagement with Earth at this stage carried an extremely high probability of failure. Not because humanity was certain to win, but because 6 non-Concord civilizations had already acknowledged Earth's new sovereign status and sent formal trade signals towards Sol. A conflict would not be humanity against 17. It would be something more complicated, and the Concord was not positioned for complicated. 3 council members read her analysis in full. The rest received summaries. Sovereign dismissed her report as speculative. He was still calling for action when the session closed. But the vote to authorize fleet mobilization failed. Narrowly, but it failed. Vareth found Breath after the session in a corridor near the lower observation deck. They stood together for a moment looking out at the stars. Vareth said, "Do you think they were always angry?" Breath thought about it. "I think they were angry every day for 100 years. I think they just had more important things to do with it than show it." Vareth was quiet for a moment. Then, "I am going to send a personal message to Administrator Sword. Not as a diplomat, just as someone who wants to ask a question." Breath said, "What question?" Vareth said, "Whether there is still a way in." They stood there a little longer. Outside the window, very far away, the Sol system sat in the dark, silent as ever, sealed as a held breath, going about its business without asking anyone's permission. 2 years passed. They passed differently for different people. For Sovereign, they passed in a long, grinding slide from power. The release of the original Reneth incident navigation logs had done exactly what Earth had presumably always known it would do. It moved slowly through Renethi society like a slow fire through dry wood, burning in one place for a while and then jumping to another. First it was academics asking questions, then journalists, then, eventually, ordinary Renethi people who had grown up being told the incident was a border accident and were now reading the calculation logs themselves and understanding what the word deliberate actually meant when applied to 83,000 deaths. Sovereign was removed from his ambassadorial position 8 months after the Concord session. The official reason was retirement. The unofficial reason was that the Renethi collective needed someone who could open a conversation with Earth without the conversation immediately ending, and Sovereign had made that impossible by being exactly who he was for exactly as long as he had been. His replacement was a younger Renethi diplomat named Osra Vel, who had read every available record of human Concord interaction 3 times before accepting the position, and who opened her first private channel to Sol Sovereign Authority with no preconditions attached. Just a message that said, "We would like to talk, if that is still possible." The reply from Administrator Sword came within a day. It said, "It is still possible." It named a time. For Breath, the 2 years passed in a kind of sustained intensity that she had not experienced before and was not sure she would want to experience again, though she suspected she would. Her formal analysis of the Sol situation had been read by enough council members to change her standing considerably. She had been promoted twice. She was now the Quillari Concord's lead analyst for non-member civilizations, which was a job that had previously been quite small and was now, suddenly, very large. She had also been exchanging messages with someone on Earth. Not officially, not through any channel her office knew about. Doran Fell had written to her 4 months after he left Vareth 9, from somewhere he did not specify, with no explanation of how he had found her personal contact. The message was short. It said, "I thought you might have questions. If you do, I am willing to try to answer them honestly." She had many questions. Over the following months, she sent them, and he answered, and occasionally she sent a follow-up, and he answered that too. He never told her anything she could have used politically. He never revealed timelines or strategies or the names of people involved in decisions. What he told her was smaller and, in its way, more useful. What it had felt like to sit in a Concord session and say yes to something that was not right. How you kept doing it without breaking. What you held on to when the work was long and the result was still decades away. He told her once, in a message that was longer than his usual ones. The difficult part was not the waiting. People assumed the hard thing was waiting. But waiting is just time. The hard part was being genuinely kind to people who had decided that kindness meant weakness. That costs something different than anger does. Anger is a fuel. Kindness under pressure is a decision you have to make every day, without anyone knowing you are making it. She had printed that message and kept it. Now she was on a transport heading toward the edge of soul space, where a new station had been built. It was the first structure constructed jointly by human, Dravani, and Quillari engineers. 3 different species, 3 different building traditions, somehow producing a station that managed to look deliberate rather than accidental. The docking bays were human in their layout. The materials used in the observation decks were Dravani, a particular alloy that filtered light in a way that was easy on multiple different types of eyes. The cultural archive on the station's 7th level had been designed by a Quillari spatial planner with a very specific philosophy about how memory should be stored. The station had no name yet. The inaugural naming vote was scheduled for next month, open to all member species of the new arrangement, which did not call itself a concord or an authority or an alliance, but simply an open table, a phrase that had come from Earth's initial proposal document and had survived all the translation and revision to remain in the final text. There was no tier system. Every delegation had equal standing. Every vote counted once. Breath found Doran fell on the 7th level, in the archive. He was sitting at a wide desk surrounded by data tablets and physical notebooks and several cups of something that had gone cold. His hair was fully gray now. He looked settled, in the way that people look when they are doing the thing they were always meant to be doing. He was cataloging languages, not translating them, not comparing them, but recording them in their original forms, building a library of how different species said the same things in different ways. He looked up when she came in. He was not surprised to see her. She said, "Did you always know it would go this way?" He thought about it for a moment, not performing thought, actually thinking. He said, "We knew it would end. We did not know how. We just decided, a long time ago, that however it ended, we would end it standing up." He was quiet for a moment. Then he added, in a lower voice, as though saying something he had thought many times but not often said out loud. The hard part was being kind to people who assumed kindness meant weakness. That takes more out of you than anger does. We had to choose it fresh every day for 100 years. Before she could respond, a child wandered in from the corridor outside. She was maybe 8 years old, visiting the station with her family, clearly having gotten slightly ahead of them. She stopped in the doorway and looked at the room with the alert, unworried curiosity of someone who finds everything interesting and has not yet learned to be embarrassed about showing it. She looked at Fel and asked what he was doing. He said he was writing down all the words for all the things people feel but cannot say. She thought about this. Then she asked why. He said, "So that nobody has to carry them alone." She nodded as if this was a reasonable answer to a reasonable question, and then wandered back out into the corridor to find her family. Fel watched the doorway for a moment after she was gone. Then he picked up his pen and went back to work. Breath stayed for a while. Neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. Outside the wide windows of the archive room, 6 ships moved in slow formation away from the station. Human, Dravani, Quillari, and 3 others from civilizations whose names most of the Concords still did not know. They were not warships. They were survey vessels, long range, equipped for years of travel, going in a direction that had not yet been mapped by anyone sitting at any table currently in existence. They moved without hurry. They had somewhere to be, and they were going there, and nobody was stopping them. That was enough.